Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another PS5 video. So since we're at the start of a new year, I thought it would be a good idea to do a general rundown of the current state of PS5 jailbreaking at the beginning of the year, so that we can use this as a data point to compare the progress made this year to the same time next year to see what's changed. Also, PS5 jailbreaking can be quite a bit more confusing now that we have different levels of exploits spanning multiple firmware versions. So if you're someone looking to get into PS5 jailbreaking for the first time, it can be quite intimidating. So when it comes to jailbreaking a PS5, whether that's a fat, slim or pro model, what matters more is the firmware version that the console is on. This is known as your system software version, and you can find it by heading to the settings, system software and console information. And there you want to look at your system software version. We only care about these numbers after the first dash. This shows the console here is running firmware 2.30. This one here is on 4.03 and this one here is on 7.61. So that's how you can tell what firmware version your console is actually running. Now, in order to jailbreak the PS5 fully, we typically need 3 exploits chained together: a userland, also known as user mode exploit, a kernel exploit, and a hypervisor exploit. Now, we need something we can execute custom code on, like the web browser or Blu-ray drive, that has a vulnerability to escape the sandbox. That's our userland exploit. Then a vulnerability in the kernel to allow us to gain privileged access. And finally, the PS5 has a hypervisor as an extra security measure that restricts access to the kernel, so that needs to be worked around or bypassed as well. So given that, here's the situation on each firmware version. So generally, the older the firmware version, the more exploitable it's likely to be, as PlayStation are constantly improving their security measures in newer firmware releases. So the earliest exploits are for firmwares 1.00 to 2.70. We have a full jailbreak on these firmware versions with a userland, kernel and hypervisor exploit chain. The current implementation uses the web browser as our userland exploit. Simply add a custom DNS address in the network settings that will redirect the user guide page over to an exploit site. Once there, we can run the jailbreak, which loads the UMTX kernel exploit, which is remarkably stable on these firmwares. We can then run a payload called ETA-hen, which is the homebrew enabler, which will put the console into rest mode. After recovering from rest mode, we can simply enter the exploit page again, but this time we select the WebKit only sender to go right to the payload select page and launch ETA-hen a second time. This rest mode process bypasses the hypervisor and gives us our full jailbreak. This exploit is known as the Bypervisor exploit by Spectre. As for what we can do on these firmwares, we can run homebrew apps like PS5 Explorer, Items Flow and the Homebrew Store. We also can run PS5 game backups from their original game files through Items Flow as a virtual app. We can also install and run PS4 games through fake packages, just like on the PlayStation 4. We also have access to cheats and patches through PS5 Debug. This allows us to add things like cheats, like God mode, infinite ammo, infinite money, those kind of things, as well as enable hidden developer menus and debug menus, and enable 60 FPS patches and even up to 120 FPS patches for PS4 games running on the PS5. Not to mention PS2, PS1 and some Sega Saturn games from PlayStation's own software-based emulators, which are more open source emulators that I believe PlayStation has just co-opted and obviously modified somewhat to use on the PS4 that we can run on the PS5 through backwards compatibility. Finally, we have a different way of loading Homebrew through the Homebrew launcher, which uses a web server running on the PS5 to load the Homebrew. This offers Homebrew like the offline account activator, remote play enabler, some retro emulators like RetroArch, and ports for other retro PC games like Diablo, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and more. We can also fully dump and decrypt our PS4 and PS5 games and turn them into playable backups on these firmwares that can run without the original game disk. However, this feature within Items Flow is only available for 2.00 to 2.70 for now. Despite 1.xx firmwares having the same jailbreak as 2.xx, they have less features available as there's very few people on these firmwares to help port things and test. Also, 1.xx cannot run many PS4 or PS5 titles, so having game dumping features on these firmwares would be kind of redundant anyway. Luckily, people on these firmwares can always update to 2.00 to 2.70 in the future to gain access to these features. There's also the possibility of loading Linux with this jailbreak, although that's not currently available. So that's pretty much what we've got there for the full jailbreak from firmwares 1.0 up to 2.70. So now let's move on to the next set of firmwares, which is going to be firmwares 3.0 up to 4.51. These firmwares also have access to the same userland and kernel exploit as 1.00 to 2.70. The UMTX kernel exploit is more unstable on these firmwares, meaning you're more likely to run into the occasional crash when trying to load the jailbreak from the browser. There's another kernel exploit on these firmwares known as the IPv6 kernel exploit that can also be loaded from the browser as another option that's slightly more stable. However, we don't currently have a hypervisor exploit available for these firmwares yet. Luckily, we do have a workaround for the hypervisor's restrictions from Ostrowski and Zenal Pointer, which spawns a daemon process that runs in the background and handles any requests that would normally require kernel patches. It's known as the libhijacker, but it has evolved over the years into various other payloads that use it, including the most significant one from Slayer's Govey, which is known as PS5 Kstuff or kernel stuff, that allows loading homebrew apps, PS5 game backups, and PS4 fake packages, along with the existing features of the libhijacker like cheats and patches. So you basically get the same feature set that you get on 1.00 to 2.70, albeit with a few downsides. The daemon process isn't perfectly stable, and you can run into some strange issues with your games, like audio bugs, lag, and of course longer loading times. However, most PS4 and PS5 game backups run without issues. We also cannot have too many processes running at the same time, as the daemon can get overwhelmed with too many requests, causing slowdowns and instability issues. So that's pretty much where we are with 3.0 up to 4.51. Now we can also run more PS5 game backups on these firmwares when compared to 1.00 to 2.70, as the higher the firmware, the more PS5 games are loadable, as new PS5 game releases typically require a firmware version that's similar to whatever the latest firmware happened to be at the time of the game's release. So the older the firmware that you're on, the less PS5 games you will be able to run. This issue could be mitigated somewhat with backports in the future to allow PS5 games dumped on higher firmwares to be ported to older ones, like on the PS4. However, we're still in the early stages of that process, so not many backports are really playable yet on older firmwares. It's important to note that this isn't an issue with PS4 fake packages, as we already have backports for most PS4 games to allow them to run on older firmwares on the PS5, so that's not really a problem there. So that is one advantage right now for 3.0 to 4.51, is that you have access to run more PS5 titles than you do on 1.0 to 2.70 for now. Next up we have firmwares 5.00 to 5.50. They also use the same userland and UMTX kernel exploit as the rest, but again they do not yet have access to a hypervisor exploit, and worse still, they also don't yet have access to the PS5 Kstuff or a similar workaround for the hypervisor. This makes it much more limited. At the time of recording, we have access to PS5 debug on these firmwares for cheats, patches, developer menus, and remote debugging software, the homebrew launcher for offline account activation, remote play enabler, retro game emulators, and more. And we can also install package files from the debug settings and get root FTP access to the file system, but we cannot yet run PS4 fake packages or PS5 game backups on these firmwares yet. The problem is that the libhijacker / PS5 Kstuff used on 3.00 to 4.51 uses mmap or memory mapped IO, which has been changed in 5.xx firmwares. It should be possible to create some kind of equivalent that does not use that, but it will likely take a lot of work, and as such we don't yet have a hypervisor workaround for now. But fear not, because work is undergoing to try and get these features enabled, so there's definitely a lot of progress happening on these firmwares, and I do suspect that we will see a similar level of functionality that we have on 3.0 to 4.51 come to 5.00 to 5.50 in the pretty near future. Finally, the last exploitable firmwares are 6.0 up to 7.61. Now these firmwares use the same UMTX kernel exploit as the others, but the userland exploit through the web browser that we've been using on all of the previous versions was actually patched as of 6.0 and higher. This means we need to use something else as the entry point to trigger the kernel exploit. At the moment we're using BDJ or Blu-ray Java, specifically this version from Hammer 83. This is where having a working disk drive becomes important for these firmwares, as we need to burn the ISO file to a blank Blu-ray disc and then insert it in the console and load the Blu-ray. Once it's up and running, we can inject the UMTX kernel exploit as a jar file using a payload injector from another device that's connected to the same network as the PS5. This will trigger the exploit. Once it completes, we can then inject any other payloads in the same way. But there's not much that we can currently do with this version at the time of recording, and that's because in addition to the mmap issue that we also have on 5.0 to 5.50, 6.00 to 7.61 have an additional restriction that prevents writing to kernel data pages using the current methods. So it will likely take even longer for these firmwares to get to the same level of functionality as the previous ones. Lastly, there's also another option to load this exploit through a save file, but that option isn't available yet, and we're still waiting to see if that's actually going to be a viable solution. So that's the current state of exploiting the PS5 beginning 2025. We have a full jailbreak on firmwares 1.00 to 2.70, a partial jailbreak on firmwares 3.00 to 4.51, with a workaround to enable close to full jailbreak functionality on those firmwares, a partial jailbreak on 5.00 to 5.50 that we might get full jailbreak features on fairly soon, and a more limited partial jailbreak on 6.00 to 7.61, which still we can't really do very much with right now. So that is the situation, and of course higher firmwares we do not yet have any kind of kernel exploit or hypervisor exploit for. So that is the situation we're on right now on the PS5 beginning 2025, and it will be interesting to see where we end up the same time next year. So yeah, that's basically it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And once again, I'll hopefully see you guys in the next video.